40 nights she built walls inside his mind. And somewhere between the architect and the secret, the walls stopped being his. Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The castle breathed differently at night. Hermione had noticed it in her first year. The way Hogwarts seemed to exhale once the last student retreated behind dormitory curtains, the corridors loosening into something older and less supervised than they permitted themselves to be during daylight hours. Stone that had absorbed 7 centuries of footsteps and whispered spells and suppressed tears seemed, after midnight, to release all of it at once. A low, continuous vibration beneath the soles of her shoes, like a held note finally allowed to sound. She had not expected to be walking these corridors again. None of them had. Not the ones who'd come back, the ones McGonagall had called the returning 8, the students whose 7th year had been stolen and replaced with something that did not deserve the name of education. Hermione had accepted the invitation to return, not because she needed the NEWTS. She could have sat those exams in her sleep, in her grief, in the grey-edged numbness that had followed the battle like fog following a ship. But because she did not know what else to do with herself, the war had given her a structure. Its ending had removed the scaffolding, and she'd found herself standing in the ruins of her parents' restored memories, in a house that smelled of unfamiliarity, unable to read a single page of any book without her eyes sliding off the words. Hogwarts, at least, knew how to hold people who were slightly broken. McGonagall's letter had arrived on a Tuesday. The second letter, the one sealed with a different charm entirely, the one that had arrived an hour after the first, delivered not by owl, but by a small enchanted fold of parchment that unlocked only under Hermione's specific magical signature, had arrived on Tuesday evening. She had read it 4 times before she understood what was being asked of her. Then she had read it a 5th time to be certain she had not misunderstood. Miss Granger, what I am about to ask of you exists outside every protocol I would ordinarily observe. You are not obligated. You may refuse, and nothing between us will be diminished by that refusal. But I find myself in the position of having very few people I trust, and even fewer with the particular combination of skills this situation requires. Mr. Malfoy has agreed. Whether you agree is entirely your own determination. She had agreed. Of course she had agreed. Hermione Granger, who had spent 6 years cataloguing every injustice and filing it under things to be corrected, could not read a letter that said the remnant is reforming, and we have one person inside it, and respond by going to bed. What she had not fully prepared for was this: the specific texture of waiting outside room 3C on the 3rd floor of the East Wing at 11:15 on a Wednesday evening, listening to her own heartbeat and trying to determine whether the unease pooling in her chest was professional apprehension or something more personal and therefore less acceptable. The door opened before she knocked. Draco Malfoy looked in the pale wand light leaking from the room behind him, exactly as she had expected him to look, which was to say, terrible. Not in the way she might have wished for in her less gracious moments over the past 7 years, not diminished or defeated in any satisfying sense. Terrible in the way of something under sustained pressure. His face had always been angular. It was sharper now, the planes of his cheekbones carrying a new austerity that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with months of existing in conditions that didn't permit softness. There were shadows beneath his eyes that no sleeping draught had touched. His robes were plain, not the expensive, self-advertising fabric he'd worn throughout their school years, but something dark and unremarkable, the clothing of someone who had learned the tactical value of not being noticed. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything these days, with a kind of careful, exhausted assessment, as though the world had proven sufficiently unpredictable that he no longer trusted even familiar things to behave as expected. "Granger," he said. Not mudblood, not the sneer she'd spent 6 years bracing for each time she heard her name in his voice. Just her name, stated flatly, like a coordinate being confirmed. "Malfoy," she returned in precisely the same register. He stepped back from the doorway. She entered. The room McGonagall had assigned for their sessions was small and deliberately unremarkable. A circular space on the eastern corridor that had been, in various incarnations over the centuries, a storage room, an unofficial detention chamber, and, according to Hogwarts, a history, a 17th century divination outpost before the discipline fell temporarily out of academic favour. It held 2 chairs, a low table on which someone had placed a pitcher of water and 2 glasses with the impersonal care of a healer's waiting room, and a single window through which the grounds were visible, silver dark, the lake a flat mirror holding the inverted moon. No candles. The light came from a pair of wall sconces, burning with a steady, cool luminescence. Not firelight, not the warm amber that Gryffindor common rooms ran to, but something closer to moonlight bottled, throwing shadows without warmth. Hermione set her bag down beside one of the chairs, removed her outer robe with the slightly over-precise movements that happened when she was managing nerves through routine, and sat. Draco remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. She noted it, filed it, before folding himself into the opposite chair with the controlled economy of someone accustomed to betraying nothing through posture. "McGonagall explained the procedure to you," she said. It was not a question. "She explained her understanding of the procedure," he said. "I expect yours is more detailed." A fair point delivered without any particular aggression. She adjusted her expectation of the evening slightly. "The occlumency block I'll construct works in layers," she said, falling into the familiar territory of explanation the way other people fell into prayer. "The outermost layer is relatively standard, the kind of barrier Snape would have taught. But the intelligence you're carrying is specific enough that the remnant's legilimens will push past standard barriers without breaking a sweat. What I'll be building is something closer to a structure within the structure, false corridors. Information arranged so that what they find first is accurate enough to be convincing, but not operationally significant." He was watching her with an expression of careful attention that she found, against her will, more disconcerting than hostility would have been. "And to build that," he said, "you need access." "Yes." The word sat between them. Through the window, the inverted moon wobbled as wind moved across the lake's surface. "How much?" he asked. His voice was level, but she had spent 6 years learning to read the subtext beneath Draco Malfoy's levelness, and what she heard beneath the question was something she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not the reflexive contempt for invasion that she'd anticipated. Something that lived closer to the bone than that. Something that sounded, stripped of its careful management, almost like dread. "Enough to map what's there," she said. "I won't read specific memories. I'm not interested in your... I'm not there for anything except architecture. Where things are stored, what's adjacent to what, which pathways lead where. I need to know the shape of it so I can build around it accurately." He looked at her for a long moment. The sconce light caught the silver of a ring on his right hand. Plain, narrow, catching the light with the small, cold precision of a blade. And she found her gaze snagging on it before she redirected herself. "And you're proficient enough," he said slowly, "that you won't drift." Drift. She noted the word. It was a precise word, a word chosen by someone who understood exactly what legilimency felt like from the inside. The intimacy of being entered. The way a mind, once opened to another, could not be entirely sure of where the visitor had been. "Yes," she said, and kept her voice from doing anything complicated. He exhaled once through his nose, sharp and controlled. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell me what I need to do." "Sit comfortably. Don't try to resist. That's important, because resistance creates pressure, and pressure creates exactly the kind of emotional markers a legilimens looks for. I need you relaxed enough that your mental architecture is accessible, open, not defended." The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile, something drier than that. "You're asking me to be undefended." "I'm aware of the irony." Something moved through his expression, too quickly for her to name it before it was gone. He settled back in his chair, let his hands rest on the armrests with a deliberateness that suggested this posture of ease was entirely constructed, and lifted his eyes to hers. Grey eyes. She had never, in 7 years of knowing him, spent more than 2 consecutive seconds looking directly into them without either combat or contempt as the medium of the exchange. Now there was nothing between them but the cool bottled light and the task, and she found herself briefly, unwillingly arrested by the specific quality of his gaze. Not cold, as she'd always catalogued it, but guarded in a way that implied something worth guarding. The grey was not flat. It held depth the way winter water held depth, apparent shallowness concealing significant distance below. She raised her wand. "Legilimens," she said quietly. The entry was not violent. She had prepared herself for resistance. Old reflexes, the memory of Snape's technique, which was, by every account, as subtle as a battering ram. But what she found was startling in its quality. His mind did not fight her. It simply received her with the wary, still attention of an animal that has decided, against all previous experience, to hold its ground. She moved carefully. She had told him she was there for architecture, and she meant it. She tracked the broad shapes of things rather than the content, navigating by the emotional temperature of different regions, the way a cartographer notes terrain without cataloguing every individual stone. Here, something dense and hot, wrapped in layers that spoke of long containment. There, a series of bright, sharp fragments, recent and unsorted, the operational debris of a person living inside a sustained deception. She did not look at what they contained. She was rigorous about this. She mapped the edges, noted the adjacencies, began to understand the particular topography of a mind that had learned, at considerable cost, to partition itself with extraordinary precision. And then, at the periphery of a region she had no intention of entering, something she had not expected. A small, undefended space. Not hidden, not armored. Simply open, in the way of something that has not yet decided whether to close. And in that space, at the nearest edge of what she could perceive without deliberately pushing deeper, was the quality of an emotion she could not name with any clinical accuracy, but which registered in her chest, in her own body, as a frequency she recognized. Loneliness, perhaps, or its first cousin. She withdrew, cleanly, without lingering. When she surfaced, blinking once in the cool light, she found that Draco Malfoy was watching her with an expression that had shed, in the 40 seconds of her access, something of its careful management. Not vulnerability. He was nowhere near vulnerability. But the armor had shifted, and in the small gap it left, she could see the outline of something younger than his years, something that had been through sufficient difficulty to lose the luxury of pretension. He said nothing. She said nothing. She began, with quiet and methodical focus, to build the first layer of the block. The work took 35 minutes. When she finished, there was a faint tremor in her left hand that she attributed entirely to concentration, pressed it flat against her thigh, and stood. "Same time Thursday," she said. He was still watching her. Can you tell me if it holds?" "I'll know more after the second session. The architecture needs setting time, like a casting." He nodded slowly. Then, after a pause long enough to be deliberate, "Granger." She had gathered her bag. Her outer robe was half over her shoulders. "What?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked, for one unguarded instant, like someone standing at the edge of a sentence they'd begun, before realizing they had no safe place to finish it. "Nothing," he said. "Thursday." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the iron handle, and the corridor beyond was dark and breathing with old stone, and the unease in her chest was entirely different in quality from what it had been 40 minutes ago when she'd arrived. She didn't look back. But in the moment before she stepped through, between the room and the corridor, between the task and whatever came after the task, she was suddenly, acutely and inconveniently aware that the small open space she had found at the edge of his mind had felt, for the half-second she'd been near it, startlingly familiar. Like recognizing a room in a house you'd never entered, but had, somehow, dreamed. She stepped through the door and walked quickly back toward Gryffindor Tower, her hand steady now, her thoughts in careful order, the moonlight on the corridor floor laying out a clean white path ahead of her that she followed precisely, without deviation. She did not think about grey eyes. She did not think about the quality of a mind that defended everything except one small, unguarded corner. She did not think about the expression on his face when she'd withdrawn, the fraction of a second between her departure and the moment he'd reassembled his composure. She thought about these things for the entire walk back, while telling herself, with great discipline, that she was thinking about nothing at all. Thursday came with rain. Not the dramatic, story-like rain of midsummer storms. Not lightning. Not thunder rolling across the forbidden forest in cinematic waves. Just the quiet, persistent Scottish rain that had no interest in being noticed, that simply arrived and remained, greying the windows and softening the edges of everything beyond the glass, until the grounds dissolved into a study in silver and slate. Hermione noticed it because she noticed everything, and because noticing things was considerably more manageable than sitting with the particular quality of restlessness that had occupied her chest since Wednesday night. She had slept badly, not unusually so. The bad sleep was a companion she'd made a kind of peace with since the war. But the specific texture of this wakefulness had been different. Not grief, not the replayed horrors that sometimes ambushed her between 2 and 4 in the morning. Something quieter and more bewildering than that. She had lain in the dark and thought about architecture. Not his, she told herself firmly, setting her arithmancy notes aside and watching rain trace its slow paths down the common room window. The theoretical architecture of advanced occlumency barriers, the layering principles she'd been refining all week, the question of whether the false corridors she'd begun constructing in the first session would hold their structural integrity under determined legilimency pressure. She was still telling herself this when she arrived at room 3C at 11:14 and found the door already open by a precise inch, warm air leaking through the gap into the cool corridor like a quiet invitation. She pushed the door open. He was standing at the window this time, rather than seated, his back to her, both hands clasped behind him with the rigid formality of a soldier at rest. He was watching the rain move across the dark grounds, and for a moment she had the strange impression that she had interrupted something private. Not a task, not preparation. Simply a person standing in the dark, watching weather, existing without performance for an audience of none. He turned before she could decide how to announce herself. The guarded assessment was back in his eyes, that careful calibration. But there was something else tonight. Something that ran beneath it like current beneath ice. She filed it without yet assigning a name. "You're early," he said. "You're earlier." He said nothing to this, which was its own kind of answer. She removed her robe, set down her bag. The ritual of it was already acquiring a texture, the specific order of her movements, the two chairs angled toward each other, at precisely the distance they'd settled into last time. The pitcher of water that someone always replenished between sessions. These small consistencies were, she understood, doing some kind of quiet work on both of them, habituating them to the strangeness, wearing down the sharp edges through repetition. "The first layer held," she said, settling into her chair. "I checked the diagnostic charm this morning. The architecture is stable." He crossed from the window and sat. In the cooler light of tonight's sconces, someone had replaced one of them, and the new one burned fractionally warmer, an amber undertone entering the room's palette. The shadows beneath his eyes were if anything more pronounced than Wednesday. He had not been sleeping either. "I had a meeting," he said without preamble. "Yesterday, with Nott." She became very still. Theodore Nott was on the ministry's secondary list. Not confirmed remnant, but adjacent enough to several confirmed members that his name appeared in the margins of 3 separate intelligence reports. "He wanted to know if I was back," Draco continued. His voice carried the flat, factual quality of a debrief, stripped of everything except information. Whether I was available for certain activities that he described in terms vague enough to be deniable. "What did you tell him?" "That I was considering my options." A pause. "That I found Hogwarts unexpectedly useful for maintaining certain appearances." She absorbed this. And he accepted that? Nott has always been patient. It's his most dangerous quality. He looked at her directly. He'll push harder at the next contact. He'll want specifics. Which means the block needs to be more robust than I'd planned for this stage. She reached into her bag, drew out a piece of parchment covered in her smallest, most compressed writing. I've been working on the false corridor structure. I want to add a second tier tonight. Not just misdirection, but active. Granger. His voice had changed. She looked up from the parchment. He was watching her with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, and not all of them were ones she could immediately pass. Something at the surface, wariness, the habitual caution, and something beneath it, pressing upward with the slow insistence of water finding cracks in stone. "What I told you about Nott," he said. "That's not in any report yet." "I understand. I won't." "I know you won't." A silence. "That's not why I told you." Another silence, this one longer and more complicated. "I told you because McGonagall is informed on a delay for security reasons, and I find that I—" He stopped. His jaw tightened fractionally. A small muscular event that she would not have noticed a week ago, would not have been close enough to observe. There are things that require a contemporary audience, apparently. She understood then what she was being offered. Not information, not a tactical briefing. The thing underneath it, the thing he'd arrived at through the only door his particular architecture permitted, the door labelled operational necessity, because walking through the one labelled I needed to tell someone would have required a vulnerability he hadn't yet located. Her chest did something quiet and complicated. "I'll keep a separate record," she said, matching his register precisely, giving him the dignity of the practical frame he'd chosen. "Not for the ministry, just for continuity between sessions." He exhaled through his nose, one small, nearly silent release of something he'd been holding. "Fine." "Ready?" she said. "Yes." The entry was easier this time. Not easy. She suspected it would never be precisely easy, given the specific quality of his mental fortification. But easier, the way a path worn by one previous journey is slightly more navigable than unmarked ground. His mind received her with the same careful, waiting stillness. The absence of active resistance that she was beginning to understand was not passivity, but a form of chosen trust, deliberately enacted, costing something measurable that he paid without acknowledgement. She went to work. The second tier was more delicate than the first, a series of nested misdirections that required her to understand not just the placement of his operational memories, but the associative pathways connecting them. The way his mind cross-referenced information, the emotional weights that made certain memories more or less accessible, the particular logic of a consciousness that had been trained since childhood to present one surface while maintaining an entirely different interior. She worked with the focused attention she brought to the most demanding magical theory, and beneath the work, something else moved in her, quiet and unbidden, a kind of reluctant, growing regard. Not for what he was doing. She'd had the abstract respect for that since McGonagall's letter. Something more specific. The internal landscape she was navigating was not simple. It was not the flat, defended blankness of someone who had shut everything down to survive. It was intricate. It held contradictions. It it held evidence of sustained, effortful thought about difficult questions. Questions she recognized by their shape, by the emotional weight they carried, without reading their content. Questions that began with "What did I do?" and continued into territory that required considerable courage to keep inhabiting. She did not read them. She mapped their presence and moved on, and told herself that the warmth in her chest was professional appreciation for a complex subject. And then she found the unguarded space again, larger than Wednesday, all perhaps the same size, but differently configured, as though between sessions it had expanded slightly, the way a door left ajar will drift further open in a through breeze. She paused at its edge with the same discipline she'd exercised before, intending to note it and withdraw. What stopped her was not curiosity, or not only curiosity. What stopped her was the recognition, arriving with the precision of a key entering a lock, that the emotional frequency emanating from that unguarded space had changed. On Wednesday, it had been loneliness, or loneliness adjacent, a flat, horizontal ache, old enough to have lost its sharp edges. Tonight, it was something less settled, something with more movement in it, a restlessness that had a specific direction, a magnetic property oriented toward. She withdrew, faster than the first time, cleaner, sharper, a withdrawal with an edge to it that she felt in the sudden small tremor in her wand hand. When she surfaced, he was watching her, and his expression had come apart slightly at the seams in a way that she suspected neither of them was going to acknowledge. She began the second-tier construction with methodical precision, her breath even, her movements deliberate, her attention nailed to the work. The tremor in her hand subsided. The room was very quiet except for the rain against the single window. She finished in 40 minutes. When she lowered her wand, the silence between them had a different specific gravity than it had carried at the start of the session. She was aware of it, of the weight of it, the way it pressed gently on her sternum. And she was aware of him being aware of it, though neither of them moved or spoke for a moment longer than was strictly warranted by exhaustion. "The second tier is set," she said. "It'll need reinforcing in about a week, depending on how much active use the region takes." He nodded. His hands were resting on the armrests again, that constructed ease. But the silver ring caught the warmer light of the replaced sconce, and she noticed, against every intention, that the skin at his right knuckle was abraded, recent, as though something had connected with it, or it had connected with something in the last 48 hours. She did not ask. He caught her looking. Neither of them said anything about it. "Granger," he said, when she was standing, her bag over her shoulder, her robe back in place. "What?" He was looking at the middle distance between them, not at her, not away, but at the air that separated them as though it contained something worth examining. "The space, when you're in there." He stopped, reassembled. "You said you weren't there for the contents, just the architecture." "That's correct. And you're—" Another pause. This one had a quality she couldn't name, except by what it cost him, which was evidently something. "Consistent about that." She met his eyes. The grey of them in the warmer light was no longer winter water. It was something with more amber in it, more depth, more of the complicated interior she'd been carefully not mapping. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She was aware of counting them involuntarily, and then looked away toward the rain-dark window. The line of his shoulders, for just that duration, had released something, a fraction of the constant maintenance, a barely perceptible softening of the machinery. "Good," he said quietly. To the window, or to himself, or to some private reckoning she hadn't been invited to witness. She left. The corridor received her in its old stone silence, and the rain tapped its patient code against every window she passed, and she walked with her arms folded against the castle's night chill and the full knowledge, admitted now without the earlier pretense of clinical distance, that the frequency she'd found at the edge of his unguarded space, the restlessness with direction, the magnetic pull oriented towards something specific, had resonated in her own chest with a recognition she could not attribute to legilimency. She could not attribute it to anything except the deeply inconvenient and entirely unasked for truth that she had felt it too. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that only extraordinary things can manufacture ordinariness as a disguise. Hermione attended lectures. She completed her transfiguration essay 4 days before the deadline, as was her custom, and spent the surplus time rereading the occlumency theory she'd already memorized, looking for nuances she might have missed, finding none, and reading it again regardless. She ate breakfast at the Gryffindor table between Ginny and Neville, contributed the appropriate portions of conversation, laughed at the appropriate moments. She was, by every external measure, entirely herself. The internal measure was less tidy. She had developed, without planning or permission, a new habit of awareness. It operated below the threshold of conscious attention, mostly a peripheral tracking, the way you become sensitized to a particular sound after hearing it once in the dark. In the great hall, at the long Slytherin table across the room, a pale head bent over a plate, eating with the focused economy of someone fueling a machine rather than taking pleasure in a meal. In the corridor outside the library, a set of footsteps she'd learned to distinguish from the general acoustic texture of Hogwarts' populated hours. Slightly longer stride than average, unhurried, the faint sound of the silver ring occasionally grazing a stone wall in passing. She did not seek these observations. She simply noticed that she was making them, and that the noticing had begun approximately 72 hours ago on a rainy Thursday night, walking back from the East Wing with her arms folded and her thoughts in a state she refused to call disorder. On Sunday, Ginny asked her what she was thinking about. Occlumency, Hermione said, which was true. Ginny looked at her with the particular expression she developed during the war, the one that meant, "I know you're not lying, but I also know you're not finished," and returned to her Quidditch diagrams without pressing further. This was one of the things Hermione valued most about Ginny Weasley. She understood the difference between a secret and a wound, and she had the patience to wait for the distinction to become clear. Monday passed. Tuesday. The sessions were Wednesday and Thursday each week, and by Tuesday evening, Hermione had read the same paragraph of her charms textbook 11 times and retained none of it. She arrived at room 3C on Wednesday at 11:13. The door was closed. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the hollow echo of her own arrival fading into the old stone, and felt the small, precise drop of something she categorized immediately as not disappointment, simply recalibration. She raised her hand to knock. "It's open," he said from inside. His voice came through the wood with unexpected clarity, as though the door had thinned itself to accommodate the transmission. She pushed it open. He was seated already, which was different. Not at the window, not standing with that military rest posture. Seated in his chair, elbows on knees, studying something in his hands that he closed and pocketed before she could identify it. His robes were darker than usual, a near black that absorbed the sconce light rather than reflecting it. And there was a quality to his stillness tonight that was not the stillness of composure. It was the stillness of something that has been moving too fast for too long and has temporarily run out of the resources required to continue. She noted the abraded knuckle. It had not healed. Someone had not used deepening on it, or had chosen not to. "You look terrible," she said, and then experienced the swift internal consequence of having said an honest thing without first running it through the usual filters. He looked up at her. Something crossed his face. Surprise, she thought, genuine and unguarded for a single instant. Then the corner of his mouth shifted in the direction of what might, in better circumstances, have been wry. "Flattering as always, Granger." I meant... She stopped, sat down, straightened her already straight cuffs with two precise, unnecessary adjustments. "Another meeting?" The almost wryness left his face. "Two. Not on Saturday, and someone else on Monday. Someone I hadn't expected to surface yet." "Who?" "Yaxley's nephew." He said it with the flat evenness of a name being placed on a table for examination, stripped of the emotional weather it carried. "He was at school with us, 2 years above. You may not remember him. Aldrich Yaxley." The name surfaced from her memory without difficulty. A broad, quiet boy who had always stood at the edge of things, watching. The ones who watched were the ones she'd learned to be careful of. "I remember him." Draco's eyes moved to her with a fractional sharpness. "Of course you do." "What did he want?" "The same thing Not wants, dressed in different clothes." He leaned back in his chair, tipped his head against the high back, looked at the ceiling. In this posture he looked exhausted, in a way he hadn't permitted himself to appear while looking directly at her. Reassurance that certain old loyalties are still operative, that the right people are still aligned. "And you gave him what he needed to hear, what I've been trained to give people." His jaw shifted. "I'm very good at it by now, saying the true-sounding thing that contains no actual truth. You'd be surprised how little people examine what they're told when they want badly enough to believe it." The bitterness in this was not directed at her. She understood that. It was directed inward, at something he was examining in himself with the dispassionate relentlessness of someone who has decided that honesty, at least in the private internal reckoning, is non-negotiable. "Draco," she said. The name arrived in the room before she'd consciously decided to use it. She felt the air change slightly, a small barometric shift, like the moment before weather commits to itself. He lowered his gaze from the ceiling. He looked at her. She had not called him that before. Not in 7 years of knowing him. Not in 2.5 weeks of sessions in this room. The name had existed in her mouth with the specific weight of something held carefully, the way you hold a piece of glass you're uncertain about. Possible utility, possible danger, requiring a particular quality of attention. The block is holding," she said, continuing without pause, giving the name the cover of context. "But if the frequency of contact is increasing, I need to adjust the reinforcement schedule. Twice a week may not be sufficient." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression acknowledged what she'd done. The name, the deliberate covering of it, the practical bridge she'd built over it, without requiring either of them to address it directly. "3 times?" he said. "Possibly, or longer sessions. I'd rather extend duration than increase intrusions. Every entry is a small risk, regardless of my skill level." "You're very confident in your skill level." "I'm accurate about my skill level," she said. "There's a difference." His mouth moved. This time it reached something closer to an actual expression. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one, a softening of the lines that had been drawn tight all evening. It lasted approximately 2 seconds before the fatigue reclaimed it. "3 times then," he said. "Add Saturday, if that works." Saturday works. She reached for her wand. The session began. But something was different tonight, and she recognized the difference within 30 seconds of entry. His mind, which had on 2 previous occasions received her with careful stillness, was not still. It was not resistant. He was not fighting her. Nothing had changed in his willingness. But there was a kind of atmospheric turbulence running through it, the mental equivalent of weather. The operational regions she'd built around were under some kind of sustained internal pressure, hot at the edges, and the false corridors she'd constructed in the second session were carrying more load than she'd anticipated, flexing against the weight of whatever he'd been carrying since Saturday. She reinforced methodically, moving through the architecture with focused efficiency, shoring up the places where the pressure had begun to create hairline fractures in the layering. It required more concentration than the previous sessions. She was dimly aware, in the portion of her attention not absorbed by the work, of her own breathing, the specific quality of the room's cool air, the faint sound of wind finding some gap in the castle's exterior stone and making of itself a very distant, sustained note. And then, unavoidably, the unguarded space. She had been careful on 2 previous occasions. She was careful tonight. But the turbulence running through the surrounding regions had pushed it closer to her working path than before. It was no longer at the periphery, but adjacent, directly beside a corridor she needed to reinforce. And the frequency emanating from it tonight was not the quiet loneliness of the first visit, not the directional restlessness of the second. It was her name, not literally. Minds did not work in text. But the emotional shape of what radiated from that small open space had the unmistakable frequency of a specific person being thought about, the particular mental warmth of a recurring subject, the way someone occupies a room inside you after sufficient repetition, the temperature of sustained, unwilling attention. She withdrew, not cleanly this time. The haste of it cost her. She surfaced with a sharp intake of breath, her hand dropping from where she'd been directing the wand, and for a moment the room was too bright, and she was too present in it, every surface too distinct, the chair arms too solid, the sconce light too specific in its warmth. Draco was watching her. His face, in the aftermath of her abrupt withdrawal, had done the thing it did, assembling itself, reaching for the neutral guard position. But she had surfaced too quickly, and he had not had the full customary second to complete the reconstruction. She saw, before the composure closed over it, the expression underneath. Not shock, not embarrassment, though there was a faint high colour along the ridge of his cheekbone that the poor light could not entirely obscure. Something that looked like a man who has been found in possession of something he would rather have kept hidden, and who is now in the process of rapidly calculating whether to deny it or simply endure being known. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind found its gap in the stone again and made its small, desolate sound. "The reinforcement is complete," she said. Her voice was level. She was very proud of it. He said nothing. She stood, and the movement was slightly too swift. Her bag caught on the chair arm, and she disentangled it with two sharp gestures. And when she reached for her robe, it slid from the back of the chair, and she caught it before it reached the floor. And none of these small physical mishaps were visible in her expression, because her expression was doing exactly what she required it to do. "Granger," he said. She paused, back half turned to him, robe in both hands. "You were in there longer than usual." A statement. Factual, without accusation, without the thing they were both not acknowledging. An off-ramp if she chose to take it. A way to reduce the entire encounter to a technical note. She turned. He was sitting very still. The high colour had faded, or he had controlled it, which amounted to the same thing, and his face had achieved something close to its usual guarded equilibrium. But his right hand had closed around the ring, thumb pressing against the inner surface of it, and this small pressured gesture said the things his expression had been trained not to. "I'll see you Thursday," she said. He held her gaze. 1 second, 2. "Thursday," he said. She walked to the door and through it, and the corridor closed around her in its stone and shadow, and she walked back toward Gryffindor Tower with her robe properly over her shoulders and her bag properly settled and her face in perfect order. And she did not stop until she reached the 4th floor window seat that looked out over the rain-dark grounds, and she sat down in it and pressed her forehead briefly, precisely against the cool glass, and allowed herself 30 seconds of absolute honesty. He thought about her. In the undefended part of himself, the part he hadn't bothered to fortify because he hadn't imagined anyone would find it. In that space, she was there. Had been there, probably, since before she'd found it. 30 seconds. Then she straightened, pressed her palm flat once against the cold stone of the sill, and stood. The walk to Gryffindor Tower was long, and she made it without hurrying, carrying with her, like a coal held carefully in cupped hands, the knowledge of what she had not quite, not yet, not tonight, allowed herself to feel in return. The mission went wrong on a Friday. Hermione didn't know this until Saturday morning, when McGonagall summoned her to the headmistress's office at 7:45 with a note delivered by a tartan-edged Patronus that said nothing except "come now" in a tone that even a Patronus could apparently carry. She had dressed in under 4 minutes, which was a record, and arrived to find McGonagall standing at her desk rather than sitting behind it, a distinction that mattered because sitting implied administration and standing implied crisis. And McGonagall's hands were clasped behind her back with a rigidity that spoke of sustained self-control. "He missed the check-in," McGonagall said. without preamble. Last night at 11. He was due back within the castle by 10:30. The monitoring charm on his room went inactive at 9:17. The floor did something underneath Hermione's feet that she refused to acknowledge. What was the operation? A contact in Nocturne Alley, low-risk categorization. McGonagall's mouth compressed. Categorizations are occasionally incorrect. Has anyone? I have 3 people looking. Discreetly. The last confirmed sighting was Diagon Alley at 6:15 from a ministry operative who didn't know to pay attention. A pause. I'm telling you, because you are the person who knows his current mental architecture most precisely. If he surfaces and makes contact, you need to be prepared to work quickly, whatever the state of him. Whatever the state of him. Hermione passed this phrase with the clinical portion of her mind, while the rest of her did something cold and immediate that she recognized as fear. I understand, she said. She went to breakfast and ate nothing. She sat in the library for 4 hours with a book open in front of her that she did not read. At 2 in the afternoon, Ginny found her in the 4th floor window seat, the same one, the one with the stone sill she'd pressed her palm against on Wednesday night, and sat beside her without asking why she was there. Something's wrong, Ginny said. I can't tell you what. You don't have to. Ginny's shoulder pressed against hers in the uncomplicated solidarity of long friendship. Is it fixable? Hermione looked at the grounds below, the bare November trees, the lake hammered to a pewter sheet by the cold. I don't know yet. At 4:17, a folded piece of parchment appeared on the stone sill beside her hand. It unlocked under her touch. 2 words in handwriting she did not recognize, which meant it had been transcribed through a relay. East Corridor. She was on her feet before Ginny could ask anything, moving through the castle with a speed she disguised as purposeful stride, down 2 staircases and through the passage behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy into the East Wing's quieter arteries. He was in the corridor outside room 3C. Not inside. Outside, standing with his back against the stone wall opposite the door, and the sight of him stopped her 4 feet away with an involuntary physical arrest, the way you stop when a step you expected to be level turns out to drop. He was upright. That was the first thing, and for a single second it was the only thing that mattered. Upright, breathing, present. Then the details assembled themselves, the set of his jaw, which was doing considerable structural work, the way his left hand hung at his side with a slight, unnatural stiffness from the wrist, the cut above his right eyebrow, thin and already clotted, the dried blood a dark line against his pale skin. His robes were clean. He'd changed, or been helped to change, but the collar sat wrong, slightly off-center, as though it had been straightened in haste by someone who hadn't known his particular standards of precise arrangement. His eyes found hers. Something moved through them. Relief, she thought. And beneath the relief, something rawer, something that had been waiting with more than patience through whatever the last 19 hours had contained. "You're here," he said. His voice was not quite steady. This was the most information he had ever volunteered in a single phrase. "I'm here," she said, crossed the remaining 4 feet, stopped close enough to examine the cut without touching him, because she was not yet certain what touching would cost either of them. "What happened to your wrist?" "Sprained, not broken. A pause. I checked. You checked yourself. There was a situation. Sit down, she said. Not unkindly, but without room for negotiation. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has survived something through sustained effort and is not entirely certain what to do now that the effort is no longer required. Then he turned and pushed open the door to room 3C and sat in his chair, and she followed and cast a silent locking charm on the door and set her bag down and extracted the small medical kit she'd been carrying since the second week of sessions, because she was Hermione Granger and she planned for contingencies. The cut first, she said, drawing her chair closer than usual, close enough that when she leaned forward to examine it, their proximity crossed from professional into something she was consciously not categorizing. It's fine. I'm aware it's fine. I'm going to clean it anyway. She dampened a piece of cloth with the deepening solution from the kit and reached for his jaw to angle his head. Her fingers found the sharp line of it. He was very still beneath her hand, with the particular quality of stillness that was not indifference, but its opposite. And she cleaned the cut with 3 careful strokes and applied the deepening and watched the red line pale and then vanish into the smooth skin above his brow. She did not move her hand immediately. He did not move away from it. For 3 seconds, 4, her fingers rested against his jaw and the room held its breath, and she was aware of the specific temperature of his skin, warmer than the stone-cold air of the castle, warmer than she'd expected, and the slight tension of the muscle beneath her palm as he held himself carefully still. She withdrew and addressed the wrist with the same focused attention. "What happened?" she said, quietly, while she worked. Not a question. An opening. A long pause. Outside, the November wind pressed against the window, and the lake would be black now, beyond the glass, with the last of the afternoon light entirely gone. "Not wasn't alone," he said. "There was a woman I didn't know. She was a legilimency." His voice had found its flat debriefing register, but it was costing more to maintain tonight, the effort visible in the slight deepening of his breathing. "She tried to get in before I'd established the block properly. Before I'd—" He stopped. She looked up from his wrist. "Before you'd run the preparation sequence," she said carefully. The preparation sequence, the 60-second internal exercise she'd taught him 2 weeks ago, the way you walked through a particular mental posture before entering a high-risk environment. It required stillness and 3/4 of a minute, and was entirely incompatible with a situation that moved faster than expected. She was quick. Something moved through his jaw. She got past the outer layer. Hermione's hands had gone still on his wrist. "How far?" "Not far." The second tier held. His eyes met hers with a directness that cost him something visible. "Your work held." She breathed out. The cold thing in her chest that had been resident since 7:45 that morning released its grip by a fraction. "The wrist was the exit," he continued. The situation required physical resolution in a confined space. It was not elegant. "You should let Madame Pomfrey know. Flat, immediate. No one outside this room knows the details of last night. If Pomfrey asks questions, which she will, the story becomes complicated." She wanted to argue. She knew enough about triage to understand that a sprained wrist, properly bound, would heal without lasting consequence. and she told the part of herself that wanted to argue with him to stand down and be practical. She bound the wrist with the steady efficiency of someone who had learned field medicine in a tent in the Scottish Highlands during a war. And when she tied off the last wrap, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such unguarded attention that the breath snagged briefly in her throat. "Thank you," he said, quietly. The two words sat in the room with unusual weight, as though he'd been carrying them for some time and had only just found the doorstep to set them down on. She sat back, did not move her chair away. "The block," she said. "The second tier. If she pushed against it, even without breaching it, there may be stress fractures. I need to go in and check." He nodded slowly. His eyes hadn't left her face, and there was something in them tonight that the clinical frame of the session was not quite containing, the way water finds the low places in an insufficiently sealed surface. "Legilimency," she said softly. The entry was different. She had entered his mind 4 times now, and each time had its own texture. The first formal and mutual strangers, the second more navigable, the third turbulent with the pressure of his contact meetings. This was different from all of them. The mind that received her was not turbulent. It was very quiet. The quiet of exhaustion, yes. She could feel the weariness distributed through it like sediment after disturbed water settles. But beneath that quiet, something else. Something that had been reorganized by the events of the last 19 hours, the way a storm reorganizes a landscape, moving things that had been fixed into new configurations. She checked the second tier. It had held. He'd been right. The architecture she'd built had absorbed the external pressure without breaching. But there were hairline fractures in 3 places, and she moved through them with careful, precise repair work, sealing each one with the patient attention of someone who understands that what matters most is not the dramatic structure, but the small, unnoticed points where things are most likely to give way, and the unguarded space. It was not where it had been, not the periphery, not adjacent to the working corridors. It was closer, significantly, undeniably closer, as though the architecture of the night had shifted it toward the center, as though whatever had happened in the last 19 hours had rearranged his internal geography in ways that moved certain things out of the guarded edges and into more central territory. She did not go near it. She finished her work and withdrew, clean and careful. When she surfaced, he was still watching her with that uncontained quality, and the room was very small, and she had not moved her chair back. "It's repaired," she said. "You should sleep." "I know." Neither of them moved. Draco. The name came more easily than the first time. Its weight had changed, not lighter, but more familiar, worn to a more comfortable shape through use. "I waited today, since McGonagall told me this morning. I want you to know that." She had not planned to say this. It was true, and she said it with her eyes level and her hands still in her lap, and she watched him receive it. The thing that happened to his face was not dramatic. It was not the undoing she might have imagined in a more theatrical version of this moment. It was smaller and more significant than that. A single, almost imperceptible softening at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes, which had been holding a guarded distance even through their exhausted openness, shifted into something she could only describe as warmth. Careful, tentative, as though warmth was a temperature he hadn't trusted himself to maintain in a long time. "I know," he said again. And this time the two words carried a different weight entirely. She stood, made herself stand, gathered her kit, her bag, her composure. At the door she paused. Behind her she heard the small sound of him shifting in his chair, and the particular silence of a person watching someone leave and making no move to stop them because they lack the language for what stopping them would require. She pressed her palm flat against the door. "Sleep," she said. "I'll check the reinforcements Saturday." "It's already Saturday," he said quietly. She looked at the clock on the wall. 12:43. He was right. "Then I'll check it this afternoon," she said. She opened the door and walked out into the dark corridor, and the castle breathed its ancient breath around her, and she carried in her chest, carefully, the specific warmth of his eyes. At the moment she'd told him she had waited, the way it had entered him, the way it had mattered. And she held it like the coal in cupped hands, all the way back through the dark sleeping castle to her bed, where she lay awake until dawn with her eyes open and her heart doing something complicated. And entirely, she was beginning to understand, inevitable. The afternoon session on Saturday lasted 52 minutes. Hermione knew this because she counted, not deliberately. The counting happened beneath the surface of her concentration, an involuntary metronome, the way the mind tracks certain things without being asked to, because it understands at some level below articulation that they are worth tracking. He was more himself than the previous night. Slept, or something adjacent to sleep. She could feel the difference in the architecture when she entered. The sediment settled, the turbulence quieted into something workable. The hairline fractures she'd repaired at midnight showed no signs of reopening. She reinforced their outer layer, checked the false corridors, made 3 small adjustments to the second tier that the previous night's stress had rendered necessary, and withdrew at the 52-minute mark with everything structurally sound and her hands entirely steady. What she did not do was look at the unguarded space. She was disciplined about this. She noted its position, closer still to the center than it had been Saturday morning, a migration that her professional mind catalogued as operationally significant. And her other mind, the one that had lain awake until dawn, catalogued as something it had no clean clinical vocabulary for. And she moved past it without approaching, with the deliberate unseeing of someone who has decided that a particular door should remain closed until they have determined what they will do if they open it. He noticed her restraint. She was almost certain of this, from the quality of his silence when she surfaced, from the way his eyes held hers for a measured beat before he asked about the repair work. He noticed, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and they discussed the technical outcomes of the session with the scrupulous professionalism of 2 people who are both very good at maintaining surfaces. She left at 3 in the afternoon, with the winter light already failing outside the east wing window, the grounds going grey and then blue, and then the particular swallowed dark of November's early evenings. Everything was fine until Tuesday. Tuesday arrived with the quality of days that have bad news already packed into them, visible in retrospect as having been wrong from the first light. The cold had sharpened overnight, and there was ice on the inside of the dormitory window when Hermione woke, which she had not seen since her 4th year, and which struck her as an omen of the variety she did not believe in, but noted regardless. She found the letter in her bag during charms. Not a letter. A folded piece of parchment, ministry sealed, tucked into the front pocket of her bag between her spare quill and the dittany she now carried habitually. She did not recognize the seal. She waited until Professor Flitwick had directed attention to the demonstration at the front of the room, opened the fold with the precise minimum of movement required, and read. It was short, 5 sentences. The handwriting was professional and anonymous, the kind produced by someone who had learned penmanship as a tool rather than an expression. Miss Granger, your involvement in a classified ministry operation has come to our attention through channels we are not at liberty to disclose. We are writing to request your cooperation in providing a full account of the occlumency work you have been conducting. This is a matter of operational security. Please understand that the individuals involved in covert operations of this nature are subject to ongoing review, and that inconsistencies between accounts can have significant consequences for all parties. She read it twice. Then she folded it with the same precise minimum of movement and placed it back between the quill and the dittany, and she sat through the remaining 40 minutes of charms with her face arranged in the expression of attentive engagement that she had perfected over 7 years of managing internal weather while maintaining external calm. She was angry. The anger was a clean, specific thing, not the hot, explosive variety, but the cold, illuminating kind that sharpened everything it touched. Someone inside the ministry knew. Not McGonagall's circle. This letter had not come through McGonagall. Someone outside the approved structure, someone who had access to enough information to know that Hermione was involved, but was writing to her directly, rather than through official channels, which meant either they lacked the authority to compel a formal interview, or they preferred, for their own reasons, to keep this off the record. Both possibilities were alarming in different ways. She went to McGonagall before dinner. McGonagall read the letter with an expression of perfect stillness that Hermione had learned to recognize as the headmistress's equivalent of considerable alarm. She read it twice, refolded it along its original creases with the care of someone handling evidence, and set it on her desk. When did this arrive? During charms. I don't know how it got into my bag. That's a ministry insertion charm, relatively restricted access. McGonagall's lips compressed. This is Harwick's office. Hermione knew the name. Unspeakable Adjacent, one of the ministry's internal security divisions, the kind that operated in the spaces between official mandates and their own considerable discretion. What do they want? They want to know if Mr. Malfoy is reliably compromised. McGonagall said it with the flat precision of someone removing a splinter, directness as the most efficient form of mercy. There are elements within the ministry who would prefer that his intelligence be redirected through a different handler. A handler they control. Yes. The silence in the headmistress's office was the particular silence of 2 people reaching the same conclusion at the same moment. They'd need to replace the block, Hermione said. Someone else would need access to his mind, which would require his cooperation or his incapacitation. McGonagall held her gaze. He doesn't know about this letter yet. I want you to tell him. Tonight, before the session, so that he has the full picture. He needs to make an informed decision about how to proceed. You're telling me that his safety depends partly on whether he trusts me enough to continue. I'm telling you, McGonagall said carefully, that the situation has become more complicated and that your relationship with him is now operationally significant in ways that exceed its original parameters. Hermione walked to the East Wing that evening with a letter in her bag and an uncomfortable awareness of how much had changed in 3 weeks. She had arrived at room 3C for the first time as a technician. She was arriving tonight as something for which she did not yet have a precise name, carrying news that she would need to deliver with both honesty and care to a person who had, through sessions and silences and one abrupt withdrawal and the warmth of his eyes at midnight, become something she did not yet have a precise name for either. He was standing at the window again. The moon was out tonight, a hard, cold 3/4 moon that laid silver geometry across the corridor outside and edged the room's shadows with clarity. He turned when she entered, and she saw immediately that he already knew something was wrong. It was in the set of him, the shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness. "What happened?" he said. She gave him the letter without preamble, watched him read it, watched the muscles of his face work through several things in rapid succession. She was becoming fluent in the vocabulary of these small muscular events: the jaw, the faint whitening around his mouth, the fractional narrowing of his eyes. And when he refolded it, his hands were controlled, but the silver ring had marks on both sides of it from the pressure of his grip. "Harwick," he said, "you know him. I know of him." He set the letter on the low table with careful precision, as though its placement mattered. "He's been trying to insert an operative into the Remnant through a different channel for 6 months. His candidate doesn't have my access, and Harwick knows it." His voice was very level. "So, instead, he wants to compromise mine. By replacing me." His eyes came up to hers. In the moonlight, the grey of them had gone almost silver, and there was something in them, a guardedness of a different quality than she'd seen before, layered over something much less guarded. "By replacing you," he confirmed, "or by using whatever you tell them to destabilize the operation from inside. I won't tell them anything." "I know," said immediately without deliberation. Then he seemed to hear the speed of his own certainty, and something shifted in his expression, a recognition, and with it a complicated vulnerability, the look of a person who has just involuntarily revealed something about the state of his own trust. She sat down. He remained standing for a moment, and then sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and the posture stripped away the last of the evening's performance. No constructed ease, no military formality. Just a man in a chair at 11 o'clock at night who was working through something that had several sharp edges. "They'll keep trying," he said. "If this doesn't work, they'll try something else." McGonagall is handling the official response. There are protocols for unauthorized ministry contact with Granger. He looked at her directly. "I'm not worried about McGonagall's protocols." "Then what are you worried about?" The questions sat between them, and the room's moonlit silence held it, and she watched him decide, watched the moment of decision, the fractional muscular shift of someone choosing honesty over the safer option. "That they find something to use," he said. "Something that..." He stopped, his thumb pressed against the inner surface of his ring. There are things in my mind that have no operational significance, that aren't part of any intelligence, that are private. And if someone else goes in, someone whose purpose is extraction rather than protection. She understood precisely what he was saying. The unguarded space, the region she had navigated around with such careful restraint for 3 weeks, the central territory she had refused to approach, which held, she knew, without having read its contents, in the way you know the weight of a room before you've seen what it contains, something he would not survive having handed to Harwick's operative like a debriefing document. "That won't happen," she said. Her voice was steady and very certain. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite disbelief and not quite hope, but occupied the complicated territory between them. "You can't guarantee—" "I can guarantee that I won't let anyone else conduct these sessions." She held his eyes. "If Harwick wants access to you, he goes through McGonagall's authorization chain. If he attempts anything outside that chain, there are 3 separate layers of magical contract between us that make unauthorized access a ministry-level offense." She paused. "I had McGonagall draw them up after the 2nd session. Precautionary." The silence that followed this was of a different quality from all the silences that had come before. He stared at her. Something moved through his face that she had not seen there before. Unguarded, unmanaged, too quick to be caught by his control before it had already happened. "You did that after the 2nd session," he said slowly. "Yes." "Before not? Before any of the complications?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was doing the thing it had done briefly on Saturday morning and more extensively on Friday night. The undoing of the surface, the thing beneath it rising close enough to be visible. But tonight, it didn't retreat. It stayed there, present and unguarded, and somehow more frightening to witness than any of his careful composure had ever been. "Why?" he asked. The question was small and direct, and cost him something considerable to ask. She could see the cost of it in his jaw, in his hands, in the precise quality of the stillness with which he waited for her answer. She thought about Thursday night in the 4th-floor window seat, her forehead against the glass. She thought about the coal in cupped hands, carried carefully through the dark, sleeping castle. She thought about the particular warmth of his eyes at midnight, when she'd told him she'd waited, and the way that warmth had entered him and mattered. "Because," she said carefully, "the work I'm doing in there is precise, and precision requires continuity." A pause. "And because the block I'm building is built around specific architecture that only I know." Both of these things were true. They were also, she understood, and she believed he understood, not the whole answer. He looked at her. She looked back. The moonlight lay between them like a third presence. He nodded once, slowly, and said nothing further, and she reached for her wand. But when she said legilimency and entered, the unguarded space was no longer navigable around. It was central, undeniable, and emanating from it, with a quiet, steady frequency of something that had decided to stop pretending it wasn't there, was warmth. Specific, directional, and carrying unmistakably her name. She completed the session. She repaired what needed repairing. She withdrew cleanly and set down her wand and looked at him and said nothing. And neither did he. but the moonlight in the room was very bright, and his eyes in it held something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. And when she walked out into the corridor, the cold stone air of the castle felt, for the first time all autumn, like something other than cold. The cold came properly in December. Not the ambient chill that had been settling into the castle since November. That had been a gradual dimming, a slow withdrawal of warmth like a tide going out. This was different. This arrived overnight between the 3rd and 4th of December with the conviction of something that had been patient long enough and was done with patience. And by morning, every window in Hogwarts wore a second pane of frost on its interior surface, and the corridors breathed visible air, and the lake had acquired a skin of ice along its northern edges that caught the low winter sun and held it, flat and merciless. Hermione noticed the cold, the way she noticed everything, completely, and with particular attention to what it meant for the work. Cold affected concentration. It affected the fine motor precision required for delicate occlumency construction. She added an extra layer to her robes, cast a permanent warming charm on the stone floor of room 3C between sessions, and told herself this was the extent of December's relevance. She and Draco did not speak outside sessions. This was not a rule they had established. It was simply the shape of things. The operational logic of the situation argued for discretion, and discretion argued for the appearance of the ordinary, which for them meant the 7 years of established indifference that the rest of the school had always observed. In the great hall, he sat at the Slytherin table, and she sat at Gryffindor, and they did not look at each other with any greater frequency than chance and proximity required. She was, she told herself, entirely comfortable with this arrangement. The sessions continued. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. They had increased to 3 per week after the knot escalation, and the rhythm of them had become the fixed points around which the rest of her week organized itself, without her having made any conscious decision that this should be so. She was aware of this. She noted it with the same careful attention she brought to everything, filed it under things requiring eventual consideration, and did not consider it. What she did instead was become extraordinarily proficient at the block. The architecture she'd built over 6 weeks had achieved a complexity and elegance that she suspected exceeded anything McGonagall had originally envisioned. A nested system of misdirections and false corridors and weighted pathways that would give even a highly skilled legilimens nothing of operational value while appearing, to a moderately skilled one, entirely genuine. She was proud of the work. She was allowed to be proud of the work. The work was excellent. She was also, beneath the excellence of the work, aware with increasing and impossible to manage precision of his mind's interior. Not the contents. She remained disciplined about contents, but the quality of it, the texture of his consciousness, which she had come to know the way you know the particular smell of a room you have entered many times, not through deliberate study, but through accumulated, unavoidable familiarity. The specific weight of his concentration when something had happened during the day that he was processing, the way his mental architecture relaxed fractionally, never fully, never without its foundational wariness, but by a degree she could now measure when she entered. The unguarded space, which had been central for 3 weeks now, and which she navigated around with the precision of a cartographer who has mapped a particular landmark so many times she could trace its outline with her eyes closed. She did not touch it. She did not touch it right up until the Monday of the 2nd week of December, when she entered the session to find that it was gone. Not moved. Not relocated to a new peripheral position. Gone, where it had been, was a closed surface, a smooth wall with no seams, the seamless closure of something that had been carefully, deliberately shut. She completed the session. She withdrew. She set down her wand. The room was its usual cool silver, the warming charm she'd cast on the floor radiating up through the soles of her shoes, the sconces doing their work with steady indifference. Draco was watching her with his usual post-session attention, the quiet watchfulness of someone monitoring for information. And she looked back at him and said nothing about what she hadn't found. "The reinforcement is holding well," she said. "No fractures. Good. The knot corridor is the most stable it's been. Whatever he tried at the last contact didn't create any structural stress. He was less aggressive this time." A pause. "He's waiting for something." She nodded, filed this, stood. "Granger." She paused. He was looking at the low table between them, not at her. His profile in the sconce light was clean and controlled and entirely unreadable. "Harwick made contact again," he said. "Not with you this time. With me. Through a third party." She sat back down. "When?" "Saturday." Saturday. 3 days ago. 3 days during which she had sat across from him in these sessions, and he had not mentioned it, had debriefed her on Knot and 2 other contacts, and said nothing about Harwick. "What did he want?" she asked. Her voice was even. "He wanted me to provide him with an independent account of the session structure." His thumb moved against the ring, that small, pressured gesture she'd catalogued weeks ago as the thing his hands did when he was managing something he hadn't yet decided how to hold. He framed it as a standard review, oversight procedure. And I told him I had no obligation to cooperate with any review outside the authorized chain, and that he should take the matter up with McGonagall. He looked up from the table. His eyes were very steady, which I expect he won't, because what he's doing isn't authorized oversight. It's private intelligence collection. You should have told me immediately. She kept the words level, kept them clean of the edge that was running beneath them. I know. This is exactly the type of contact that... I know, Granger. Something in his voice, very quiet, not sharp, something that lived closer to tired than anything else. I know what I should have done. She looked at him. He was looking back at her now, and his face had a quality she hadn't seen before. Not the exhaustion she'd observed after difficult operations, not the careful blankness of sustained performance. Something more interior than those. Something that suggested the 3 days between Saturday and tonight had contained more than the simple withholding of information. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. A silence. Long enough that the wind outside made its gap in stone sound twice before he answered. "Because his questions were about the sessions," he said, with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word from a set of options. About the nature of them, specifically about... He stopped. The thumb pressed harder against the ring. About whether the relationship between handler and subject had remained professional. The word professional arrived in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The rings spread outward through the silence. She understood immediately. Harwick wasn't just trying to redirect intelligence. He was building a case for removing her specifically, not by replacing her, but by discrediting the arrangement, by suggesting that what happened in room 3C had moved beyond its operational parameters, by implying that Hermione's judgment had been compromised by precisely the thing she had been telling herself for 6 weeks to stop noticing. "He's trying to find a conflict of interest," she said. "Yes. And you didn't tell me for 3 days because I didn't know what you'd do." He said it quickly, with the bluntness of something that has been held too long and has finally found its exit. Then, slower. "Whether you'd decide the risk wasn't worth it. Whether you'd go to McGonagall and request reassignment before he could force it." She stared at him. He was holding her gaze with a specific quality of stillness that she now understood was not composure. It was the opposite of composure. It was what he looked like when he was not moving, because movement would cost more than he had available to spend. "You thought I'd leave," she said. He said nothing, which was its own form of confirmation. And here was the thing. Here was the thing that she had been keeping carefully in the cupped hands of her internal management for 6 weeks. The coal she'd carried without letting herself feel its heat fully. The fact that he had closed the unguarded space. That he had shut it, cleanly and deliberately before tonight's session. That the region of his mind where she had been, without ever touching it, recognizably present, where she had felt the warmth of being thought about, the specific directional frequency of a recurring subject, was now a smooth wall with no seams. He had closed it before telling her about Harwick, because he had thought she might leave, and he had not wanted her, when she left, to be able to take that with her. The specific quality of pain this produced in her chest was unlike anything the previous 6 weeks had generated. It was not the complicated warmth she'd been managing. It was sharper than that. It was the pain of a kindness perceived too late, of someone protecting themselves in exactly the way they'd learned to, through careful and preemptive closure, and the protection being legible to her as the wound that had made it necessary. She stood. She moved to the window, which she had not done before in any session, and she stood with her back to him and looked at the ice-edged lake and the hard winter stars above it, and did something internally that she could not have named aloud. A kind of reckoning, a sorting of the things she had and had not allowed herself to acknowledge. She heard him shift in his chair behind her, heard the small sound of the ring against the armrest. "Granger." His voice was very quiet. "I'm not going to leave," she said. To the window, to the ice on the lake. Silence. "I'm not going to request reassignment. I'm not going to tell McGonagall that the arrangement has become complicated." She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, felt the bite of the frost against her skin. "And I'm not going to pretend to Harwick that there's nothing here worth protecting, because there is, and I am not in the habit of pretending things are simple when they aren't." The silence behind her had a different quality now. She could feel it, the specific texture of his attention, the weight of his regard crossing the room's cold air to the back of her head, her shoulders, the flat of her hand against the glass. "What are you saying?" he said. not quite a question. She turned. He was still in his chair, but he had leaned forward again, elbows on knees, and his face was undone in the way she had seen only twice before. At midnight on the Friday of the mission, and in the 3 unguarded seconds on Thursday 2 weeks ago, when she'd named the contracts she'd had drawn up. The composure was entirely absent. What was there instead was a man of 18 who had lived through more than most people twice his age, who had been performing calculated survival for so long that the stopping of it looked, from the outside, like something close to vertigo. "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that you can open it back up." He looked at her. The meaning arrived in him. She could see the arrival of it, the way it moved through his expression in a slow, deliberate wave. "What you closed," she said, "before tonight. You don't need to keep it closed." He stared at her for a long moment. The sconce light was steady, and the frost was on the window behind her. And outside the castle, the winter night was absolute, and between them, the air held a charge she had no technical vocabulary for, a static, a pressure, a slow magnetic insistence that had been building since a rainy Thursday in November and had arrived tonight at something close to its limit. "Hermione," he said. Her name, not Granger. Her name in his voice for the first time, and the sound of it was so different from every previous context, so stripped of distance, so direct, that she felt it physically, a tremor that began in her sternum and moved outward. She did not look away. He did not look away. Outside, the winter pressed its cold geometry against every surface of the castle, and the ice on the lake caught the stars, and the room was very small and very still. "Thursday," she said finally, quietly. It was not a deflection. It was a door left ajar. He heard it as such. She could see in the slight, fractional shift of his expression the understanding that Thursday was not a closing, but a continuation, that she was not retreating, but was asking them both to hold what was in the room tonight, carefully, until there was more space to hold it in. He nodded, once. She collected her things. At the door she paused, as she always paused, and the corridor beyond was dark and cold. "Open it back up," she said again, without turning. Quietly, as if the repetition were a gift, something pressed into his hands for the hours between now and Thursday. She stepped through the door into the winter dark of the corridor, and behind her she heard nothing. No movement, no voice. Only the small, precise sound of someone breathing differently than they had been before. Thursday arrived the way significant things often do, without announcement, wearing the ordinary clothes of just another day. Breakfast was porridge and grey light through the great hall windows. Hermione's tea went cold while she read the same line of her transfiguration notes 4 times. Across the hall, at the far end of the Slytherin table, a pale head bent over a plate with characteristic economy of movement, and she did not look at it more than twice, and both times she looked away before the looking could become something with more weight than accident. Ginny, beside her, said nothing, but she moved the cold teacup and replaced it with a fresh one without being asked, and this small act of precise, unspoken care was so exactly what was needed that Hermione felt, briefly and inconveniently, the specific pressure behind her eyes that preceded tears she had no intention of producing at 8:15 on a Thursday morning in the Great Hall. She spent the day in the forward motion of routine. Charms, Arithmancy. 2 hours in the library on a theoretical framework for her advanced magical theory paper that she had been using with increasing transparency to herself as a method of filling time between sessions. She ate dinner. She sat with Harry and Ron in the common room for an hour. Harry talking about aura applications, Ron talking about the canons with the unflagging optimism of the committed. And she contributed her appropriate portions and laughed at the right moments. And at 10:45, she said she needed air and was not queried because they knew her well enough to understand that "I need air" was a complete and sufficient sentence. The castle at 10:45 on a December Thursday was blue, dark and cold, and her breath made small clouds that dissolved into the corridor air like thoughts too brief to hold their form. She walked the familiar route, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of someone who has decided to be deliberate about the journey, and arrived at room 3C at 11:03. He was waiting, not standing at the window this time, not seated in his usual careful posture. He was standing in the center of the room, between the 2 chairs, and the positioning was unusual enough. No furniture between them, no table, no established spatial choreography, that she registered it immediately as a choice. She stepped inside, closed the door, did not cast the locking charm, which was also a choice. They looked at each other in the sconce light. He had shaved recently. She noticed this only because the usual very slight shadow along his jaw was absent, the line of it clean and sharp in a way that suggested the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided to arrive at a particular evening without the accumulated texture of days. His robes were the dark, plain ones, but they sat differently tonight. She could not have said precisely why. Some quality of the way he was standing in them, as though the decision to stand in the center of the room had reorganized something in his entire physical bearing. She set her bag down by the door. She did not move toward her chair. McGonagall spoke to Harwick, he said. "I know. She told me this morning." A pause. "He's backing down. Officially." "Officially." She noted the qualifier. "He'll try something else eventually. Different approach." His jaw shifted fractionally. "But not immediately." "No." She held his gaze. "Not immediately." This was not why either of them was in this room on a Thursday at 11 o'clock. They both knew it. The Harwick information was true and relevant and entirely beside the point, and the fact that he had led with it told her something specific about the internal negotiations he had been conducting between Monday and tonight. The same negotiations she'd been conducting from her side of the equation for 4 days. She waited. He looked at her with the grey eyes she had stopped cataloguing as winter water weeks ago, that she had no current metaphor for, because every metaphor she reached toward seemed too small for the specific quality of attention they carried when they were directed at her without armor. He looked at her, and she could see, in the slight unevenness of his breathing and the set of his hands at his sides, not clasped, not in the constructed ease position, simply hanging open, that he had arrived at this evening having made a decision, but not yet having navigated the distance between the decision and its execution. "I opened it," he said, quietly. She had known he would. She had known it, or hoped it, or the thing between knowing and hoping that has no clean designation. In any case, she had not been surprised when she'd lain in bed the last 4 nights to find her thoughts returning consistently to that phrase, to the specific quality of his voice when he'd said her name on Monday. Hermione. First time. The way it had moved through the air between them with the weight of something long held, finally released. "I know," she said. She had not yet entered the session. She was telling him, without the mediation of the work, that she knew. He absorbed this. His hands closed once at his sides, a brief, controlled fist, and opened again. "This is..." He stopped. His head tilted very slightly, the way it did when he was choosing words with surgical precision. "I'm aware this is outside every parameter of what this was supposed to be." "Yes." "And that the practical complications are..." "Draco." She said it the way she'd learned to say it, with a weight she'd been allowing it to carry for weeks. "I know about the complications." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The last layer of the careful management, the outermost armor moving aside. What was underneath was not what she would have predicted from Draco Malfoy of any previous year. It was not arrogance, not the sharp defensive hauteur she'd catalogued at 11 and resented at 12 and learned somewhere between a Hogwarts hallway and a tent in Hampshire to understand as the architecture of someone who had never been taught a better defense. What was underneath was much simpler than any of that. It was a person who had been alone inside his own decisions for a very long time, looking at another person and not quite knowing how to close the remaining distance. She crossed it. Not to him. Not yet. She moved to her chair and sat, and nodded toward his, and he came and sat across from her, and the familiar arrangement of the room reasserted itself around them, but everything inside it had shifted by the precise amount required to make it entirely different. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. Not operational, not Nott or Harwick or the Remnant. She held his gaze. "Something that's yours." The silence that followed this request was very long. She watched him navigate it, watched the internal process, visible in the small muscular language of his face, of someone being asked to produce a thing they have not been in the habit of producing, that requires locating a part of themselves that has been in storage. "I used to draw," he said finally. She had not expected this. Her expression, she hoped, remained steady. "Architecture, mostly." "Buildings." He looked at his hands in the way of someone who has not recently looked at them for this particular reason. "My mother had she had books, old ones, illustrated. Buildings from the 17th century, mostly, before magic had made structural ornamentation redundant. She'd leave them out on Sunday mornings." A pause. "I copied them. For years. I was..." The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite the almost smile. Something more internal than that. Meticulous about it. Snape would have said obsessive. She thought of the architecture of his mind, the extraordinary precision of its construction, the nested structures, the careful corridors. The work of a mind that had been practicing structural complexity since childhood, for pleasure, before it had become a survival requirement. "Do you still?" she asked. "No." A beat. "I don't..." He stopped. "I haven't had... There hasn't been much occasion for Sunday mornings this past year." She thought of the year he'd meant. 6th year, the dark mark on his arm, the cabinet in the room of requirement, The weight of an impossible task settled on the shoulders of a 16-year-old boy who had not been given the option of refusal. The year she had looked at him across the great hall and seen someone hollowing out from the inside, and had felt, in the part of herself that was most honest, the complicated, unwelcome stirring of something that was not pity, but was adjacent to concern. "I'll bring you paper," she said. "Proper drawing paper. I know a charm that keeps it from going brittle in the castle damp." He looked at her. The expression that moved through his face at this, at the specificity of it, the practical, characteristic Hermione Grangerness of offering a charm for damp-proofing as a response to a grief, was the most unguarded thing she had witnessed in 7 weeks of watching his face very carefully. Something broke open quietly in his eyes, not dramatically. The way ice breaks in March, not with sudden violence, but with the slow, certain surrender of a thing that has been holding itself rigid for too long, finally releasing into what it was always going to become. "All right," he said softly. She raised her wand. "Ready?" He held her gaze for a moment before answering, a moment in which she was aware of everything in the room simultaneously: the sconce light, the frost on the window, the distance between their chairs, the specific quality of the silence. "Yes," he said. She entered, and the unguarded space was there, central, open, more open than she had ever found it. Not the guarded openness of someone who has stopped defending, but the active openness of someone who has decided, with full knowledge of what the decision costs, to unlock a door and step back from it. She did not approach it. She had told herself for 7 weeks that she would not approach it. She had navigated around it with the discipline of someone who understood that the moment of approach, once taken, could not be untaken, and that its taking required more than professional courage, required the particular courage of someone who has weighed what they might find and decided, clearly and without self-deception, that they can bear it. She had done the weighing. She had been doing the weighing for 4 days, in the precise grey-dark hours before dawn. She let herself move toward it, not all the way, halfway, close enough that the frequency of it reached her, that the warmth she had felt in peripheral approach was now direct, immediate, and the specificity of it made her breath change in the real room, her physical body registering what her mind was receiving. It was full of her, not in the simple way of a recurring thought, in the way of a presence that has been in a space long enough to change its quality, the specific way a room is different after someone has been in it many times, the way the air holds a register of their particular being. Everything she had, in her rigid professional restraint, declined to look at directly, was here. The sessions, yes, but also before them. Corridors, classrooms, 7 years of antagonism, gradually, privately reconsidering itself. The way she'd looked at him across the great hall in 6th year. The way her voice had sounded through the wood of his dormitory door in 2nd year when the polyjuice potion had gone wrong. Practical and completely unfrightened, already containing the specific quality of competence that he had resented and been drawn to in the same breath. The texture of her fingers on his jaw, cleaning the cut above his eyebrow. Her name in her own handwriting on 3 separate ministry contracts, drawn up after the 2nd session. She withdrew, surfaced into the room with her breath uneven and her wand hand trembling once before steadying. And he was watching her with the full knowledge of what she'd found written plainly in his expression. No armour, nothing between them but the cold December air and the sconce light and the 7 weeks and everything before them. She lowered her wand. "Draco," she said, his name in her mouth and the room very still. He leaned forward from his chair and she leaned forward from hers, and the distance between them, which had been professional, operational, carefully maintained, closed by half, then by 3/4, until they were close enough that she could see the specific silver of his eyes and the slight unevenness of his breathing, and his hand came up between them, not reaching, just present, palm open, an offering rather than a demand. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Everything she had been carrying for 7 weeks, in cupped hands, carefully, telling herself it was just warmth, just professional familiarity, just the unavoidable intimacy of a mind you have entered 23 times, rose in her chest with the quiet, certain insistence of water finding its level. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around it, carefully, with the precise, deliberate care of someone who has been meticulous about things since childhood, who has been drawing architectural details in books on Sunday mornings since before he understood what precision was for. They sat like that in the sconce light, her hand in his, neither moving further, the winter dark pressing its cold geometry against the window, and the room held them in its centuries-old silence, the way Hogwarts held all its significant things, without comment, without ceremony, simply receiving what was true and had been true for longer than either of them had been willing to say. Outside, snow had begun to fall. She had not noticed when it started. It was simply there now, a soft, unhurried descent, visible through the dark window, settling without sound on the grounds and the frozen edges of the lake, accumulating with the patient certainty of something that has all the time it needs. She did not want to move. She did not move. His thumb traced once across her knuckles, a single, slow movement, the way you learn the contour of something you've been waiting to touch. And she felt it in her sternum, felt it in the specific tremor that moved through her at the contact, and she looked up from their joined hands to his face. He was already looking at her. The snow fell all night. Hermione knew this because she did not sleep. She lay in her dormitory bed with the curtains open, watching the white accumulation on the windowsill grow by imperceptible degrees, and she held in her chest the specific warmth of his thumb across her knuckles, and did not try to manage it into something more containable. She had been managing things into containable forms for 7 weeks. She was, for one night, done with that. His hand around hers, the precise, careful pressure of it, the way neither of them had spoken for a long time after, not from discomfort, not from the careful avoidance she'd grown accustomed to in their silences, but from the specific quality of stillness that settles when something long held is finally set down and both people are simply present in the changed air of its absence. She had left at midnight, not because she'd wanted to, because there were limits to what a single Thursday could hold, and she had understood, from the particular quality of his expression as she'd stood, the way he'd released her hand slowly, as though calibrating the release rather than simply ending the contact, that he understood this too, that they were both people who had learned, at considerable cost, the difference between rushing towards something and allowing it to arrive at the pace that would let it last. She had reached the door and turned. He was still in his chair, watching her, his right hand resting open on his knee, the hand that had held hers. And the sconce light was doing something to his face that made it look like a different version of him than any she had catalogued across 7 years. Not younger, not softer in any simple sense. More accurate, perhaps. Closer to whatever the original was before the years of performance had deposited their layers over it. Friday, she'd said. Not a question. Not a deflection. A continuance. The same register she'd used when she'd said Thursday in the cold corridor on Monday, and he had heard it as exactly what it was. Friday, he'd confirmed. And his voice around the word had carried a quality she was still feeling at 2 a.m. in her sternum. She watched the snow and did not try to sleep. Friday arrived clear and white and sharply cold. The kind of morning that makes the world look freshly made. Hermione walked to breakfast through corridors where the window light fell in long, snow-reflected panels across the stone floor, bright enough to make her blink. And she ate her toast and drank her tea while it was still hot, and looked at nothing in particular with the inward expression that Ginny, beside her, observed for approximately 4 minutes before setting down her own cup. "You look different," Ginny said. "I haven't slept." "That's not what I mean." Ginny studied her with the disconcerting directness she'd inherited from her mother, and refined through wartime into something considerably more precise. "You look like someone who's stopped arguing with themselves." Hermione considered this. "Perhaps," she said. Ginny picked up her cup again, satisfied. She did not ask anything further, which was exactly right. The day moved at the particular pace of days that are serving as intervals, not meaningful in themselves, but necessary, the space between 2 significant moments. Hermione attended her classes and processed their content and contributed appropriately, and beneath all of it ran a continuous low current of anticipation that she had stopped trying to suppress, because suppression, she had concluded at approximately 3 a.m, was a waste of energy she could better allocate elsewhere. At 4 p.m, McGonagall summoned her again. The headmistress's office held the specific warmth of its enchanted fireplace and the accumulated gravity of decades of difficult conversations. McGonagall was seated this time, administration, not crisis, and gestured to the chair across the desk with the economy of movement that characterized everything she did. "The remnant operation has reached a significant juncture," McGonagall said. "Mr. Malfoy's intelligence from the last 3 contacts has allowed the Ministry's authorized task force to identify 4 of the network's 7 central figures. The remaining 3 are expected to surface within the next 2 weeks. Hermione listened. She had learned, in 7 weeks, to listen to operational briefings with one part of her mind, while another part ran the relevant calculations simultaneously. "Once the final identifications are confirmed," McGonagall continued, "the active phase of the operation concludes. Mr. Malfoy's role as an embedded agent will be formally complete." A pause that carried weight. "He will require one final intensive session. The block will need to remain in place for approximately 3 weeks post-operation, during which time any residual contact from remnant members must be managed carefully. After that..." McGonagall's expression shifted by a fraction. the fraction that indicated she was about to say something outside her usual operational register. After that, the arrangement concludes its formal parameters. "I understand," Hermione said. McGonagall looked at her with the gaze of someone who has been observing people with great precision for 40 years and has arrived at certain conclusions she has chosen to leave unspoken out of respect for the people involved, rather than ignorance of the facts. "You've done exceptional work, Miss Granger," she said. "The architecture you've constructed has exceeded every standard I might have applied. I want that said plainly." "Thank you. I also want it said plainly." Another fractional pause. "That exceptional work and complicated circumstances are not mutually exclusive, and that the second of those is not my business unless it affects the first." She held Hermione's gaze with the steady clarity of someone delivering a message that has been carefully composed. "It has not affected the first." Hermione walked back through the snow-bright corridors with the specific feeling of something having been acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement carried weight. And she held this alongside the warmth in her sternum and the memory of his thumb across her knuckles and the clear December light. And she arrived at dinner and ate and spoke and functioned. And at 10:58, she walked for what she understood was the penultimate formal session to the east wing of the third floor. He was at the window. The snow on the grounds below was blue in the early dark, untouched and even, and he was watching it with an expression she could read now. She had enough context, enough accumulated sessions and silences and moments of undoing to read it as the expression of someone who is present in a moment with his full attention rather than the managed fraction he customarily allocated to the visible world. He heard her enter and turned, and the expression shifted, not away from what it had been, but toward her, including her in whatever he had been giving his attention to. This small thing, this natural and unremarkable redirection, lodged in her chest with unreasonable precision. "McGonagall told you," he said, "this afternoon." She set her bag down, did not move immediately to her chair. 2 weeks. Approximately. He looked at her steadily. "She tell you what happens after?" The formal arrangement concludes. Something in his jaw tightened once and released. "Yes." He turned back to the window briefly, the blue snow, the winter dark, and then back to her with the quality of someone who has decided to be direct at whatever cost directness requires. "I want to tell you something before we begin, before the session." She waited. He moved from the window. Not to his chair. He stopped a foot from her, closer than the session's usual geometry, and she did not step back, and he did not step forward. But the distance between them was different from every previous configuration of this room. Close enough that she could see the specific detail of his expression clearly, without the room's full distance softening it. "I spent 5 years at this school," he said slowly, "being cruel to you in ways that I—" He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I'm not going to make a speech about it. You've heard enough of other people's speeches about their wartime regrets, and you're too intelligent to find them adequate, and so am I." He looked at her with the full grey directness of his eyes, without any protective distance. "I was cruel. Specifically, deliberately, and with the particular viciousness of someone who understood exactly which things would cause maximum damage. I knew what I was doing, and I want you to know that I know it, not as preamble to asking forgiveness, just as a fact that I'm not going to put behind a closed door. She looked at him. The sconce light was steady, and the window held its blue reflected snow light, and the room was very quiet. "I know," she said. Draco." She said his name with a weight it had fully earned by now. "I know. I've known since—" She stopped, reorganized. "I don't need the speech. I've been inside your mind 23 times. I know what you carry. I know what it costs you." She held his gaze. "I'm not here in spite of that. I'm here with full knowledge of it." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing that happened to his face was slow and complete. Not the brief undoing she'd witnessed before, the momentary lapses in composure that had been immediately managed. This was different. This was a full, voluntary lowering of everything he'd maintained between himself and being fully seen. It was the face of someone allowing the room to hold them without armor, in the particular trust of knowing the room will hold. She reached up and touched his jaw. The same geometry as the night after the mission. Her fingers on the sharp line of it, the warmth of his skin, the stillness of him beneath her hand, but different in every quality that mattered. Not clinical, not careful with the carefulness of professional restraint. His hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his face, held it there. His eyes closed for a moment, and then opened and looked at her from a very small distance with an expression she had no previous vocabulary for and did not require one. "Hermione," he said. The way he'd said it on Monday, but more. The way a word sounds when it has been waiting a very long time to mean everything it means. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not dramatic. The room did not shift. No magic sparked or flared. Or rather, the magic that moved through it was of the quiet, structural variety, the kind that Hogwarts had been accumulating for 7 centuries in its stones and stairs and the air of its oldest rooms. His hand moved from hers to her face, both of them now, cradling with the same precise care he brought to everything. The deliberate, meticulous care of someone who has been drawing architectural details since childhood and understands that the most significant structures are built from the accumulation of small, exact attentions. She kissed him and felt the warmth of it move through her entirely, from the point of contact outward, and his mouth was careful and then less careful, and her hands found the lapels of his robes and held, and the room held both of them in its sconce. Warm silence, and the snow went on falling outside, unhurried, accumulating with the patience of something that knows it has all the time it needs. When they separated, it was by inches only, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing with the slight unevenness of people who have just crossed a significant distance and have not yet fully arrived on the other side. "The session," she said quietly. She felt him almost smile against her cheek, the structural precursor, the softening of the lines, and then the actual smile, which she had not seen before in any of its complete forms, which arrived unhurried and changed his face into something so different from every previous version that she absorbed it as new information, filed it under a category she was still naming. "The session," he agreed. They separated by the necessary distance, sat in their respective chairs. She raised her wand, and the familiar words, and the familiar entry. But nothing about it familiar in the way that sameness becomes invisible. She felt it fully, the specific quality of his mind receiving her, The warmth of the architecture she'd spent 7 weeks building and inhabiting, the false corridors and their careful misdirections, and the deep central regions she had learned to know by their emotional weather without reading their contents, and the unguarded space, fully, entirely open, unlocked down to its foundations, nothing between her and what it held. She let herself into it completely for the first time. It was full of Sundays, full of drawing paper and the tooth of old parchment under a careful pencil, his mother's illustrated books laid open on a table in morning light. It was full of the specific quality of 40 minutes each evening, as the only 40 minutes in a sustained darkness when something had felt, despite everything, like being held. It held the texture of her voice through the door at 11 years old, practical, unfrightened, competent, and 7 years of antagonism that had been, in its truest interior reading, a sustained and poorly managed form of attention. It held her name in his own private language, worn smooth through repetition, a word that had gathered meaning the way a riverstone gathers smoothness. Gradually, through the patient persistence of water over time, she completed her work, sealed and reinforced everything with the full precision of 7 weeks of practice and a Friday night's accumulated knowledge of what the architecture protected and why it was worth protecting. She withdrew, set down her wand. He was looking at her, and she was looking at him, and the room between them was the room they had been building toward since a rainy Wednesday in November, when she had walked through this door carrying her professional distance like a shield, and found, within 40 minutes, the first crack in it. 3 weeks, she said. Then the formal arrangement concludes. He held her gaze with the full, unguarded steadiness she had watched him arrive at across 24 sessions of incremental, costly trust. And then, he said, she thought of Ginny's assessment at breakfast. You look like someone who's stopped arguing with themselves. She reached across the space between their chairs and touched his hand. His right hand, the one with the silver ring, the one that had been open on his knee last night after she'd left, still holding the warmth of her. His fingers closed around hers immediately, with the same careful, deliberate pressure, the same meticulous certainty. Then we find out, she said, what Sunday mornings look like. Outside the window, the snow was still falling, patient, unhurried, covering the grounds in a continuous, even white that held no footprints yet, that lay open and unwritten in the winter dark. The castle breathed its slow, ancient breath around them. The sconce light held steady. His hand held hers. The arrangement had concluded its formal parameters. Everything else was just beginning.
This story started with a simple question. What if two people who hated each other had to trust each other completely? Not just work together, not just be pilot, but actually let each other in. Draco had to let Hermione inside his mind every night for weeks, and she had to protect what she found there. That is terrifying because when someone sees the real you, the broken part, the guilty parts, the lonely parts, you cannot pretend anymore. You cannot hide. And that is exactly where love begins. Not in the easy moments, not in the beautiful ones, in the moment when someone sees everything and stays anyway. Hermione stayed, not because the mission required it. She made that choice herself, quietly, early, before she even admitted it to herself. And Draco spent the whole story learning that he was worth staying for. That was the real slow burn, but the tension between them, but the slow, painful process of the person believing he deserved something good. I think that is why this story feels true, because we have all been there in different ways, afraid to be seen, afraid to stay, afraid to ask for the thing we actually want. But sometimes someone builds a door in the wall you spent years constructing, and you have to decide whether to open it. Draco opened it and she walked through. Thank you for listening to this story.